Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing on with Heroes in Crisis Part 5, this really deals more with like the aftermath, and it's almost kind of like Superman's appeal to humanity. Now, there are a couple things that go on here, but again, there's only really like two big takeaways from all this. There's only really like two big moments from this whole thing. But I like the way that this is done because I feel like Tom King uses the nature of Superman so exceedingly well. So when it comes to Superman in DC Comics, this is a very important thing to remember here. Superman is a contextual character, and what that means is that people's enjoyment of Superman comics is relative to how he's written. And while you would normally say that about a bunch of other heroes, for the most part, you can really get away with a lot of things with a lot of different heroes. With Batman, you can tell really dark and gritty stories like Batman Endgame, and you can even go back to Steve Englehart where the Joker was like dark and comedic. And you can go into those different aspects. Teen Titans, you can do a lot of teenage drama, or you could do happier stories. There's a lot of shifting around that goes there. But for Superman, he's not really that flexible. And the reason why is because of how long he's been around and what he stands for. Mark Waid did this really good interview years ago. This was probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And what he said was the reason why Superman is so popular, why he stands the test of time, is because he's everything to everyone. Like every generation, Superman is whatever that generation needs him to be. So like during the 60s when it was all anti-Vietnam War and the hippie movement was at the height of its popularity, Superman was kind of a reflection of that. He was anti-war. It was always that way. It's always been that way with his character. That's kind of how he maintains his relevance. And so one of the worst things you can do with Superman is try to kind of like force him into a role that's just not very appealing, that's not really in the nature of its character. But Tom King does that exceedingly well. And so one of the funny things about this is that it initially picks up with like the really kind of the aftermath of this article published by Lois Lane being sent out to the world, basically showing like all these revelations and all these statements and all these admissions and different things like that that were all brought to bear by the various superheroes who were out there making their admissions within the confines of Sanctuary. And so in response to this, Superman immediately addresses the crowd. And there's a reason why it's Superman. The in-universe landscape in DC Comics, Superman's the most respected superhero on the planet, right? Like his word is beyond contestation. That's the nature of his character. That's the nature of how he functions within, on Earth within DC Comics. Is it's like the one guy you don't question. And it's the one hero that like everyone has respect for. The villains respect him, the heroes respect him. Even if they don't like him, even if they fight him all the time, they still respect him. And so it makes sense to parade him out and be the one that basically says things. Because for the most part, when you're Superman, shy of somebody running up on you with kryptonite or like Doomsday, not very many people out there are going to be able to like challenge you. I mean, the number of people who can legitimately challenge Superman on Earth, you can probably count on one hand. And so with that being the case, it's not really like Superman is much of a challenge. And so there's not really a whole lot for him to lose. And so he's just kind of out there talking to everybody. And what he basically says is that he's prepared a statement for this whole thing. And what he essentially says here is that like the basis behind Sanctuary is that one, he acknowledges there was an incident that a bunch of metahumans were killed and that the prime suspects here are Harley Quinn and Booster Gold. Of course, if you guys are curious about that, feel free to watch the previous videos. But in response to this, what he basically does, while you have like Booster Gold and Blue Beetle essentially like investigating the whole crime scene, which we'll talk more about that here in a minute, Superman kind of makes this statement and basically says the whole basis behind Sanctuary was that it was supposed to be a place where heroes can go to essentially recoup from all the things they've experienced. And it's basically Superman saying like, these are just people. And that's kind of the cool thing about it is because from the way that comic books are traditionally written and the way the superheroes are traditionally done, they almost seem like gods among men. And for the average person walking around, it'd be difficult to differentiate between the two. And it's kind of a funny thing because even Batman made that case in the story that Tom King wrote, where you had Batman serving jury duty and he was questioning, Bruce Wayne was questioning the nature of the Batman concept and said that people call Batman God because Batman saves them where God does not. And so if that's the case, then they have to consider Batman God, because if that's not true, then how do you justify a man that saves him? It was this really cool introspective look at the character. But on the whole, across the board, it's usually been done in such a way that the various superheroes save the world from multiple threats. And humanity, whether they want to admit it or not, looks to those superheroes to save them, and oftentimes forgets the idea that they are just people. That more often than not, with the exception of Superman, Martian Manhunter, maybe one or two other people, that they were born on Earth, and they were born to parents, and their parents raised them to become productive members of society, and they were just trying to make their way in the world as best as they possibly can. And people forget that. People look at that and they just say like, you're a superhero, your job is to save me. And if you don't save me, it means you didn't do your job. And the idea behind this is to say like, it was a place of recovery. It was a place of respite. It was a place for these people, for these heroes to go and to basically recover from the various experiences they've had, because they can't bring that to your attention. And they can't bring that to your attention because that shows weakness. Superman can't get up there and basically start crying and showing all manner, because people will lose faith in him. If you show people that God can bleed, they will lose faith in him. Like that's the idea behind it, is that like if Superman or one of these metahumans got up there and started crying or started showing vulnerability or emotion, that ultimately people would begin to lose faith in them. Well, if they're this weak of a person, how can we rely on them to save us? How can we rely on them to be there when the times are the absolute toughest? And so with that being the case, they needed a private place where they could go to. They could spill their darkest secrets. They could tell everything that they ever wanted to get off their chest, and it would immediately be deleted. It would immediately be removed, and that would never really be the case anymore. It's kind of an interesting thing, because Superman even asked that question. He says, if this is a place that people went to, if this is a place that they went to in order to find some measure of respite, some measure of solace, does that mean that they are now unworthy because of the fact that they are human? They do need to find some way to let all this steam off, because they're not gods walking on Earth. They're just people who happen to have fantastic powers. Does that somehow make them unworthy? Does it make them people who are somehow not capable of being effective? Not only that, because of the fact that it brings them back down to base level, and because of the fact that it returns them to being perceived as humans in the mind of humanity, well, humans are fallible. Humans screw up. Humans do stupid things. People say and do things all the time that they would normally never say under any normal circumstance, but in the height of emotion, suddenly logic goes right out the window. And when that's the case, how do you in turn justify that when you've got someone like Superman? What happens if Lois Lane dies and Superman has an emotional crisis? Well, then you run into injustice. And so that's the kind of scenario that's being presented here, is what happens when those who were deemed as infallible with the power of God suddenly become fallible and emotional. Well, then suddenly the world could be turned upside down. The world could just be left in a total state of catastrophe. And that's the whole point that Superman's making here, and that's why it works so well, is because he basically says, these are people from different countries, different walks of life that I've watched day in and day out face off against threats that most of you guys couldn't even imagine, let alone see. I've seen them achieve insurmountable things. I've seen them do things that are astronomical. I've seen men and women who can tap into nature itself. I've seen those who can use the power of animals. I've seen gods who ascend from the oceans in order to try to make peace with the surface world and literally try to bridge the gap between these two things. I've met aliens from outer space. I've met other Kryptonians where I thought I was alone. I've met all these different people who come from all these different facets of what you would call the superhero community, but at the end of the day, they're still just people. They know fear, they know love, they know hate, they know all these emotions, and because they know all these things, it's easy to be overcome by them. And that's why it's so intriguing, and that's why it's so fascinating, is because he says that was the basis behind Sanctuary. It wasn't to manipulate, it wasn't to lie, it wasn't to trick, it wasn't to be a place where they could basically say, like, I killed a person and I'm essentially performing the same act as, like, confessing to a priest, and now it can't be used against me. That's not the basis behind it. It's a place for those individuals who have powers but are effectively human to basically deal with the various torments and nightmares they've endured over the course of their entire experience in the superhero landscape. And so that's so awesome, because what it does is, again, it kind of humanizes all these different superheroes. And I've seen a few complaints here and there. It's like, oh, well, here goes DC humanizing heroes again. Well, I mean, yeah, it kind of makes sense. I mean, unless you're saying Batman's not human. So again, it's sort of an interesting concept here to basically see that kind of worked in and to kind of bring them back down. Because to me, I like heroes who are relatable. Like, I like heroes who are interesting. I mean, for all the complaints people will make about DC saying, well, here they go making heroes relatable again, there's an awful lot of arguments about how Superman sucks because he's not relatable. So I like all these different points that are kind of being made here, and it's really, really interesting. But one of the big points that's also kind of made is that Booster Gold basically says, because he's a hero who's so well versed in time travel, he understands the basis behind the rules of time travel, right? Like in DC Comics, you have a kind of set of guidelines, right? Like you've got the temporal authority, whatever it is, like basically a police force that makes sure that a person from the future doesn't get time travel technology and then starts screwing up the past and totally destroying the time stream. And so one of the things Booster Gold says is that in order to verify how far back a person's gone, in order to see whether or not a person's actually time travel when they weren't supposed to, what they would do is they would take your RNA and they would compare it to your birthday. And if your RNA was off, if your RNA was not 34 years old and you're actually 34 years old, that's how they would know. And Booster Gold, basically being kind of a shady guy, has had to essentially understand this concept in order to find ways to work around it. And so when he and Blue Beetle were like investigating all these different things, what they basically discovered here is that the body of Wally West is essentially 5 days old. That something's not right, that there's something going on in this bigger picture. Things aren't really what they seem to be. Now, Tom King makes this exceedingly vague. He makes this incredibly vague, and he does that intentionally because we don't really know how this is going to go. We don't really know where this rabbit hole leads to, but it's really really intriguing, and it's actually really cool because it's one of these things where like it's effectively Tom King saying not everything is what it seems to be, not everything is what it appears to be. And again, like as the story goes on, we'll essentially begin to learn more. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.